you know a little bit about me, and I want to extend my appreciation to you all for this opportunity to talk to this very august group. I'm super impressed already with the interactions I've had with members of your organization. And I'm a little trepidatious because I know there are people in this room know an awful lot more than I ever will about the subject I'm about to talk about, at least the overall subject of the revolution in Philadelphia. But it is a great pleasure to talk to you. Before I go any further, I should just tell you probably a little bit about the organization that I belong to and is actually hosting this tour, Bicentennial celebration. So the American Friends of Lafayette is a historical organization. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, and it was formed in 1932 at where else but Lafayette College in Eastern Pennsylvania, and that's where the artifacts that AFL, the American Friends of Lafayette, has collected over the years resides, over 2,000 of them. It's just an extraordinary collection. Not the biggest by any means. And that's one of the things that we'll discover as we go down along this journey. People back then, as you know, were prolific writers, and Lafayette was certainly one of those. And he wrote a tremendous amount of material to people who were themselves very important: Washington, Jefferson, Madison. And so an enormous amount of material still exists 200 years, 250 years later. And so historians have a field day with all of this material. So tonight, we're just going to touch this, we're going to skim the surface, really, of Lafayette. I'm just going to give you enough context to explain why in the world we would want to honor this man and his legacy next year and in succeeding years. Without further ado, I think the pre-presentation publicity talked about the who, why, what, where, and when, and that's the approach I'm going to take. So, like I said, we're going to give a little bit of context, and then we'll get into his legacy. We'll talk about how we're going to celebrate that legacy, why it's important, and we'll get into quite a bit into the bicentennial details themselves. Like I said, there's a tremendous amount of material available, and so there's a tremendous amount of material written. Biographies of Lafayette still are being published. It's amazing after all this time. People are still finding reasons to write biographies of this man. There's a few from my personal collection. Yes, I have read most of them. No, I do not remember everything that's in them. And that's partly because of the way my brain works, especially. It doesn't get any better the older I get either. But there are probably some books there that you recognize. You may, if you picked up some about Lafayette over time. And we can talk about further reading as we go. So the good news is that although Lafayette has disappeared from a lot of school curricula over the years, over the last 50 years, we are indebted to Broadway in a way. Lin-Manuel Miranda has enabled us to get a little bit more acquainted. People that didn't know, well, even who Hamilton was, let alone Lafayette, now at least know the names. And we know a little bit about what he did. It's not entirely clear what Lafayette himself would have thought about his depiction on stage, but it's certainly true that he would agree. I think he did court publicity. People did, sometimes they accused him of being a little vain, but he was no stranger to publicity. He knew how to work publicity extremely well. And so I think what do I know? But I think he would have probably approved of his story at least being told, even a little garbled, on the stage and being so successful in that. So let's just talk a little bit about his early life. Gilbert, he had a lot of names, and the reason apparently he said later in life was that his mother gave him the names of all the important Catholic saints to protect him. That she could think of that would be worthwhile. So we have Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roch, not Rush, as some people pronounce, because it would need the E. If it was the French in the room could corroborate that. Gilbert du Motier was born in 1757 in Chavignac-Auvergne, a remote part of France at the time, so about halfway between Paris and Marseille. It's still pretty remote, actually. and he was born in a castle that went back several hundred years. His entire family were military, going back generations. They could trace their lineage back to the 12th century, Joan of Arc and all that kind of stuff. They were very involved. So it was quite natural that at 13, he would join the King's Musketeers. And he ended up, although he spent almost his entire early life in the castle down there in Auvergne, then he was received in court in Versailles. However, a sequence of events, tragic events in a way, obviously he lost his mother at a very young age, and then his grandfather, so his mother's father, died, they said, of grief a few weeks later. And then another uncle dies, and then eventually another grandfather dies. Well, what does that mean in terms of hereditary? It means that he became very rich very young. He didn't actually inherit all of that money right away because of, I think he had to be at least 18, if not 21. So at this stage, he's 16, and he becomes one of the wealthiest people in Europe, owning vast estates with an amazing amount of income every year. So he becomes very attractive as a potential husband to the Noailles family in particular. The Noailles family were even more accepted at court, at the court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And the Noailles family had, if they had sons, I'm not sure, but they had a lot of daughters. And one of those was Adrienne de Noailles. And so unbeknownst, there's so many great stories of Lafayette's life, but unbeknownst to both of them, their respective families decided they were going to marry. This is the age of arranged marriages, right? And so they were introduced to each other at Versailles. You know, they accidentally ran into each other for a period of time. And 1 second here, I have to pause. It looks like my laptop is not plugged in, but it is plugged in. Maybe is the power strip not? Thanks. So yes, so he's at this point, she's about 13, and he's 16, and although they were introduced to each other and betrothed, thank you very much, they don't get married until they're considered of age. So at 16, they marry. He's 16, she's 14, they marry. As you can see, they eventually have 4 children. One of whom died in infancy, and a little sneak preview of Lafayette's homage to George Washington. He actually names one of his children George Washington, and rather interestingly, he names one of his children Virginie for Virginia, of course. But he's a political animal, so he also includes Marie Antoinette in there as well. So, she was known as Virginie, and he was definitely known as George or George Washington. So that's early life. How do we now jump from there to how does he get involved in the American Revolution? So he is on maneuvers at Metz in northeastern France, and his mentor and commanding officer is the Duc de Broglie. It's pronounced Broglie, but it's actually spelled Broglie. So you see in that name, I'm talking about the same person, Duc de Broglie. And the Duc de Broglie invites the Duke of Gloucester, who is George III's younger brother, to dinner. And like a lot of brothers, those 2 brothers, the younger brother and George III, don't get on. In fact, they are politically completely opposite. And at this dinner, to which Lafayette has been invited, he gets to hear about the insurgents, the rebels in America against the crown, and he becomes quite interested. And so at this time, we have the Enlightenment taking place. I'm not doing justice to the philosophy of the time, but he's picking up on all of this new information, these radical ideas about self-government and people thinking for themselves and running their own lives without a divinely inspired monarch. At the same time, he gets exposed to some of these thoughts in salons in Paris, and he becomes a Mason. And if you know anything about the Masons, and I don't know a little bit, at this time when they were emerging, this is sort of the new emergence of the Masons, they were rooted in the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And so with all this going on, and I should add just a little bit, there's two other factors, because nothing is as simple as sometimes it sounds. He never really fit in at court. He was considered a little gauche. He was famous court for accidentally stepping on Mary Antoinette's feet when she was dancing with him. And there's all these kind of cute stories. And by the way, don't forget, his father was killed when he was 2 years old. He never knew his father. At the Battle of Minden, he was killed by the British. So he has a slight issue with the Brits even back then. That never really comes out too much in his writings, but certainly these stories of the Enlightenment, these brave individuals, these insurgents, these rebels in America certainly does inspire him. And he says in his memoirs, he says, quote, "I gave my heart to the Americans and thought of nothing else but to raising my banner and adding my colors to theirs." All very dramatic. And I guess it must have been. I mean, here's a young man who is unbelievably wealthy, has absolutely no reason to risk his life in doing it. He could live a totally comfortable, but in his view, totally vacuous and meaningless life at the court of Versailles. He doesn't actually need to do a thing. But he decides to make his views known in Paris, and so he gets introduced to Silas Deane, and Silas Deane has been sent over clandestinely by the Americans to recruit French engineers. Washington doesn't have it. He needs engineers badly if this war effort is going to succeed. And so he sends Silas Deane over to recruit French engineers. Silas Deane interprets that a little bit more broadly than that. And so he decides that here's this young man, he's connected to the court. He is an intimate of Louis XVI. Can see him whenever he chooses. He's the wealthiest person in Europe almost. And he's prepared to serve America without pay. How could you refuse that? So Lafayette says, "I just have one request, and that is I need a rank commensurate with my standing." And they said, "Sure, do you want to be a major general?" And he said, "Yes, thank you very much." So here's a man with absolutely no combat experience coming over to America as a major general. And so the first thing he does is he asks his father-in-law if he could go. And his father-in-law says, "Absolutely not." So he goes to Louis XVI and he says, "Can I go?" And he says, "Absolutely not." So what do you think he does? Go. As any 19-year-old would, right? He doesn't need to worry about how to get there because he can afford to buy a boat, he can afford to equip the boat, and he can afford to have it sailed across the ocean, and that's what he does. That's a lot more complicated than that. And the sub-stories, how he gets here and how he almost didn't leave France, then he comes from Spain, and he has this extraordinarily appalling journey from South Carolina to Philadelphia, and there's initially rebuff in Philadelphia because Washington is so sick and tired of French major generals showing up offering their services that he actually gives an order saying, "Don't ever send me any more French." But anyway, so he is commissioned. At some point, he realizes that it's actually an honorary position rather than a real one, but that gets changed in short order based on his early experiences in battle. And he joins Washington's staff. So we can just take a look at, this is a famous etching or engraving you've probably seen. It's supposed to have taken place at City Tower. I'm not sure that we have anything in writing suggesting that. It's a great story, so why not? They certainly did meet in Philadelphia because Washington was in Philadelphia at the time that Lafayette was finally accepted. A note that he brought with him from Benjamin Franklin didn't hurt either, by the way, saying that to Congress, you need to take notice of this guy. He's the real deal. He, as I say, he quickly joins Washington's staff. They become pretty intimate, and a lot has been talked about that. Here is a man who has no children of his own, and a young man who never knew his father. So, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that connection, and I think a lot to be said for it. It does seem that they had a very, very close relationship very quickly. It's not too long before he finds himself in battle for the very first time. This is Lafayette at Brandywine on September the 11th, 1777. Still the largest land battle of the entire Revolutionary War, and it was fought, as I'm sure you know, as the British were attempting to capture Philadelphia. And they felt like once they had Philadelphia, that the war would be over because they had the capital of the country, not really realizing that that's a very European perspective. All you had to do here was move it, right? So move it York, move it Lancaster, move it anywhere you want to move it. And so they found that actually capturing Philadelphia wasn't such a smart deal. But that during the course of that, Lafayette was wounded. I'm in danger of going down rabbit trails because some of these incidents are so illustrative of his philosophy. But you see him on the ground here. He didn't get shot off his horse. He was already officer at Brandywine. It was a disaster, obviously, for the Continental Army. But he organized an orderly retreat. Troops had never seen a major general on the ground fight voluntarily. I mean, if you fell off a horse, that's one thing. He gets off his horse and he draws his sword and he is rallying the troops to conduct an orderly retreat. So that was the kind of thing that you found him doing all along, and he became a soldier friend for that. And by the time they left Valley Forge, his troops adored it. It was very, very different to the way the Continental Army was run at the time. It was more, I'm not even sure it was a European approach, but it was certainly his. He felt like these were people he came to help, and why wouldn't he be on the ground helping? And then you're probably familiar with this famous painting. It's an extraordinarily good likeness, both of Washington and Lafayette, and this is the Valley Forge. And here's an exchange between them, which really illustrates how Lafayette's non-judgmental approach, how different it was from the other Frenchmen that had come over here with what Washington perceived as great arrogance. And it endeared Lafayette to Washington. I come to learn, not to teach. I mean, what an extraordinary thing for a young Lafayette to tell this person who he idolized. And so Valley Forge was a huge opportunity for them to cement that bond. So real quick, now the rest of the war, right? So this is going to just happen in this slide, basically, for fear of time. But Lafayette plays a huge role. He becomes quite coming from no combat experience, he becomes a military strategist and becomes very successful. He does go back to France during the Revolutionary War to get to lobby the king to come out in the open, if you will, to bring troops, real material back. There had been the Treaty of Paris signed with great jubilation while they were at Valley Forge. It didn't really work out the way that we hoped, that the Americans hoped. And so a second attempt was made, and which was much more successful. So Lafayette comes back. He's really given a lot of credit for convincing Louis XVI to engage in an all-out war, which Louis XVI knew would infuriate the British, who already knew really what he was planning, and because then they'll be re-engaging the British again after just having lost the French and Indian War a few years earlier, which was actually fought right across Europe, as you know, known as the 7 Years' War, I think. Anyway, so he's put in charge of the Southern campaign. He corners Cornwallis at Yorktown. You know what happened at Yorktown. And so Lafayette's given a lot of credit for that. He goes back to France after Yorktown and comes here actually briefly again to a hero's welcome. It was kind of like a foreshadowing of what we saw in 1824, much later. He gets in, what he really basically tries to do in France is introduce what he's seen working in America. He tries to introduce the concept of democracy, even recognizing that the conditions in France are so different from what had been the case here in America, with 300 or 400 years plus of some kind of self-rule and absolutely zero in France. And that's why you ended up with terror and all those terrible things. And because of his commitment to his ideal, he ended up not really satisfying either side. He wasn't radical enough for the revolutionaries in France, and he certainly was considered a rebel by the royalists. And so he ends up being basically chased out of France. It's just about escaped before you can see the writing on the wall, and he rushes across the line into Austrian-governed Netherlands, and it promptly gets arrested. Long story short, he gets thrown in prison for 5 years, 18 months of that in solitary confinement in appalling conditions. They're really hard even to read about. They're like, just wonder how anyone could survive that. His wife barely escapes the guillotine, but her entire family is wiped out of the guillotine. And he ends up losing all of his estates and becoming basically penniless. He does manage to gain his freedom through a variety of circumstances. Napoleon actually did play a part in that before he became dictator. He was the general of great influence, and he negotiated his release, hoping, like we think, that Lafayette would then serve him in his dictatorship. Lafayette never did. He just couldn't abide the approach that Napoleon took. wasn't gonna support any despot, monarch or dictator. He does actually end up going back to France. His wife manages to retrieve a portion of her family's estate in a place east of Paris, the Castle of Lagrange, Chateau Lagrange, which is what LaGrange, Georgia is named after, and a whole bunch of other places. And so he lives there. He basically retires for a while, and then he gets back into politics. Gets up, and there's all kinds of other things happen, of course, during that time in France, in various revolutionary stages. And in 1824, in a time of great political turmoil here in the United States, Congress decides that bringing Lafayette back, the last remaining Major General of the Revolutionary War, could help unite the country. Rather than this bickering and these factions, some of it sounds rather familiar to what we're going through today. Let's bring this man back. And 48 years after we did this amazing thing and created the world's first democracy of that type, let's bring him back and perhaps for a few weeks and see if he can reunite us, and remind us of not only the sacrifice that we made, but also of what we achieved. And so he comes. And that 1824 visit, which was supposed to last a few weeks, turns into 13 months, all 24 states that existed then, and 6,000 miles, which, if you can imagine the roads and the canals and so forth, that time was an extraordinary undertaking for someone who was 67 years old. And by that time, a walk with a cane wasn't, he was otherwise in good health, but was an extraordinary experience. So he goes back after, in 1825, he gets mixed up in the 1830 revolution. So things are still not resolved, and he died in 1834, and he's buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris, alongside Adrienne, under soil from, where do you think? Bunker Hill, exactly. So when he's here, it's not entirely clear on his last visit in 1825 whether he took the soil back with him or whether he ordered it later. But the soil was there in France, and he intended it for that very purpose, that he would be buried under American soil. And by the way, the flag that flies, the Thousand Stripes that fly over his grave still to this day, flew all the way through the Second World War. Hitler never removed it, which struck me even when he occupied Paris. It's quite an extraordinary story. Okay. All right. We're going okay, right? So that's the history piece, right? So I wanted to now turn to his legacy. We touched on it already. Some great examples of it. This is a reproduction on the left, actually, of a Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette. It was a special issue for the 75th edition, but they chose 4 quotes. So I thought we'd put those up and just take a look at them, because you can see there, and I'll let you read them as I talk over them. But you see the word liberty appearing so frequently. And that's what he really believed, that, we, by the way, we the people, that means everyone, not just a few wealthy white landowners. This is everyone. We the people It's very inclusive, and he was truly. I mean, if he's on the ground with his waving his sword, wielding his sword on a field about highly dangerous, potentially lethal situation, you get the sense that he is fighting for liberty for everybody, not just himself. And so we'll see this permeate his thinking. So what I thought we'd do is take a look at each one of those. We just pick a few of these out, and we'll start with really what is considered to be the French French Constitution, based on the U.S. Constitution. This is it. This gorgeously developed print on the left-hand side, and this is just a snippet of the. I think there are at least 17 articles, not word for word, same as the Constitution, but pretty darn close in concept and in philosophy. Again, I won't read all that, and I don't expect you to be able to probably see it all, but you can see again, I tried to pull out the words that I felt were important. And you see a lot of the First Amendment in there and a few other things about freedom of press, all the freedoms that we take for granted today, but were absolutely radical, totally unthinkable in a country like France, ruled by a king who could trace his lineage back for centuries to divine right, ultimately. Jefferson did help him write that. Jefferson, by that time, was back in Paris, and they worked together on it, and it became the basis for a lot of what Lafayette tried to push through the various versions of government in France during those years. The one thing that Lafayette really disagreed with the founding fathers about, pretty much all the founding fathers, and Washington too, and it was really broke his heart in many ways, and you see it coming through, was on slavery. He could not understand why a country that purported to be to promote freedom for everyone would ignore right in front of them the slavery of a certain group of people. And it's ironic that you see the word slavery and slaves, we will not be slaves, and you see the word used a lot by some of the founding fathers about themselves, but they never seem to think about that it actually already applies to a large proportion of people that are actually living here. He was influenced certainly by the Enlightenment, which we said, formed the foundation for a lot of that thinking. This is Nicolas de Condorcet, who wrote this treatise against slavery. And you see on the right there a quote attributed to Lafayette. It actually did come from one of his letters to, again, one of his many letters to people that he corresponded with. Is actually a map of a plantation in Cayenne or Guyana that he bought with the intention, and he did I don't want anyone to. I'm not. As I said, I'm not a historian, but and I'm bad with dates. But 1783, he writes to Washington, and he says, "Oh, wonderful news! The Treaty of Paris is signed. It's officially over. And by the way, I have this amazing idea. Why don't we, you and me, Washington and Lafayette, buy this plantation and then do what I just said?" Washington writes back and says, "That is a wonderful idea. Those type of ideas make me think even more, my dear Marquis." He called him my dear Marquis for the rest of his life, even though actually Lafayette renounced his noble title and preferred to go general. But my dear Marquis, and that was the last they actually heard. So you can make it that way you will, but and you could argue that Washington was in a different situation. But anyway, Lafayette went ahead with it anyway. But he did, of course, propose that he and Washington should go in together. When he was here in 1824, he was informed that his cook and Washington's cook, Hannah Till, was still alive. They had been, Hannah Till served Washington all the way through the Revolutionary War, starting with Valley Forge and ending in Yorktown. And actually, I think worked for Lafayette even slightly after that. She was a free black, had been enslaved, bought her freedom. Not entirely clear whether that was before Valley Forge or during, but anyway, by this time she was free, and we know that from receipts and so forth that she was being paid. When he heard that she had fallen on hard financial times, he made a point of going to see her. She was, I think, 101 years old, still living in Philadelphia, and paid off her mortgage. She lived for another couple of years, I think. There's been some very recent research. She is buried, get the name of the cemetery, buried in Southwest Philly, and it was recently rededicated by the daughters of the American Revolution, and a lot of more new research was done on that. Is it Mount Moriah? Yeah, okay. And there's a plaque there anyway. There's the Daughters of the Revolution plaque. Thank you. And obviously that's a reenactor on the left, and that we are hoping that Yuval Nielsen will come to our celebrations and play that role she's known for. She lives in the Virgin Islands. And then the center individual, James Armistead Lafayette, he was a spy for Lafayette. He was a double spy. The story goes that after Yorktown surrendered, Cornwallis was, as they did back then, they invited Cornwallis for dinner, and James Armistead shows up and he says, "Wait a minute, you're my spy," and because he was actually working both sides, but he provided incredible information, useful information for Lafayette and George Washington. And when Lafayette came through, he realized he still hadn't. I think it was in the first visit after the war. He still hadn't received his freedom, so he wrote this document intending to give support for his freedom, and he was on freed. James Armistead was so impressed with that he took Lafayette's name. And then the third person is Frank Johnson, who played for Lafayette during his tour, during that tour in 1824. If you went to the Fortin exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution, you probably saw some of the information related to that. Lafayette was so impressed with that music that he arranged for him to have a European tour. So just 3 or 4 examples. But then, because a picture speaks 1,000 words, just wanted to give you a sense here of how black, usually enslaved servants were portrayed typically during this period. And you see here we have a couple of George Washington family and one, I regret I don't know, at the bottom. But you see here the enslaved person is in the picture, but you see where they are. They're very much indistinct. They're out of sight. And you could say, well, that's domestic. What about what about militarily? Well, the same thing was true there. You have the person holding the horse, the person being painted, but it's very indistinct and always in a subjugated position. Check out Lafayette. Wow. And not only that, but and these things are important, right? There's a lot of symbolism in painting. If you notice, some people have said this person on the right of Lafayette is James Armistead. It's not entirely clear, and obviously the uniform somewhat fanciful, but it's something that Lafayette would have insisted on. I mean, it was his portrait. He gets to choose how people are dressed. If you notice, the gentleman, the black gentleman in the red tunic, his foot is actually forward of Lafayette's, which would have been totally unthinkable if you look back at the others where you don't even barely see the individual. This is Lafayette's way of showing, his position on things, and it's exactly what he did when he came over in 1824 and 1825. He's French, right? This is French in the 18th century or early 19th century. People are very respectful. You read any of the letters, they could deliver bad news in a very almost pleasant way using the kind of language. He would never have upset or tried to upset intentionally his hosts, because after all, the U.S. government is paying for this trip when he comes over. He's not spending any of his own money. So when he discovered that some of the visits to, say, his old black regiments that he knew of, or schools that were serving black children, were not on his itinerary, he went out of his way to make sure he went to visit. And when he discovered, as did happen in the South, the blacks were prevented from welcoming him to those cities, he made a point of trying to go to see them. And if he would see someone, and he seemed to have a prodigious memory. He could remember people from the Revolution. There are too many accounts where we see that happening for it to be apocryphal. I mean, it just happens too often. And we see, though, here on the print on the right-hand side, that in certain parts of the country, and this is, I think, from New York, but it's a French print, and it does show multiracial welcome for Lafayette. So women's rights. By the way, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them to go, as long as it doesn't slow us down too much. Wait to the end? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Fanny Wright, I'm not sure how well known she is. Frances Wright was Scottish. She was very much younger than Lafayette. But like I said, I'm not a historian, so I don't do a lot of original research, but I did have the great pleasure in the University of Chicago collection of reading the very first letter that Fanny Wright wrote to Lafayette. It's endearing. She actually writes to Mr. Lafayette. And then their correspondence gets much more familiar. And she explains who she is and what she believes, and so on and so forth, all radical views about women's suffrage. And he takes a liking to her. And she comes to Paris. They go to a lot of the same salons together. And when he comes over in 1824, she doesn't come with him, but she comes on a boat a couple of weeks later. The fact that she was so much younger than him and he was a widower gave some people some concern, especially his family. But we believe that the relationship was platonic. And she actually left the tour when it went south in the late part of 1824, because she was so upset at what she saw as the hypocrisy of some of the people welcoming him. They were coming out to welcoming him and to welcome him here, even though they clearly didn't share his views on things like slavery or women's rights. And so she had enough, and she went off. And in fact, she tried to do what Lafayette had done in Guyana, and she set up an enclave in Tennessee to do the same thing with freed enslaved people. And it actually didn't work out very well, and she ended up going to Haiti with that. But again, she was a doer, not just a reader. And this belief of Lafayette being a champion of women's rights held all the way through women's suffrage movement in the United States. So on the right-hand side, you see Evelyn Wainwright, Witherspoon Wainwright. That is, I don't know her, but that is not a typo. That is her middle name. And she, in her attempts to have Congress come around to her way of thinking on women's rights, goes up to this statue of Lafayette in I believe it's 1918. Anyone know where that is, by the way, the statue in the middle? It's because it's a contemporary print, but it is the Lafayette statue in Lafayette Square Park in D.C. D.C., Washington, D.C. By far the most elaborate monument there, just quite spectacular. And she praised that prayer. So still so prominent in everyone's minds that Lafayette is the savior of liberty, whatever color or gender you have to be. He had a similar relationship with the Oneida. Certainly not, I'm not sure with all Native Americans, but with the Oneida particularly, who gave him a name themselves, a special name. I cannot pronounce that. Kewala, I believe it is. Anyway, and ironically, his relationship with the Oneida was cemented in a failed attempt to invade Canada, which isn't actually very well documented. No, it's very well documented, but it was an attempt to separate Washington from Lafayette. So while they were at Valley Forge, so they had. I'm blanking on the name of the general who was running the War Council. Anyone can help me with that, but at the time, the idea was that they wanted to actually remove Washington from. Gate? I think it was. Thank you. Gate. Yes, and so they said, let's get Lafayette out of the way. Let's send him to Canada to invade Canada in the middle of winter. And Washington said, Lafayette did not want to go. Washington said, you have to go. He goes up there, finds the whole thing is a scam, and tells Washington that and comes back. But before he does so, he meets with the Oneida, and they have this extraordinary relationship. And some of the Oneida come back with him, and that's rather useful because, as it turns out, a couple of months later, you see the map on the right-hand side. Does that look familiar to anybody? I know it's kind of small. It's Barron Hill. And if you know the story of Barron Hill, if it hadn't been for the Oneida, we would be talking a very different story about I think the revolution would still have occurred, but it would have taken a very different course because the Oneida basically saved Lafayette's skin there. He disregarded not necessarily an order, but strong advice from Washington not to stay at the same place for 2 consecutive nights. He did so anyway at Barron Hill with 2,100 men. And General Howe in Philadelphia got wind of it, sent out his entire troops to capture him from 3 different directions. He thought this can't possibly fail. Probably familiar with the Michiganza that was going on at the time. That was his farewell party. He said, oh, I'm going to bring him back a trophy, and then I'm going to take him to London and parade him. I will get the boy at Barron Hill. And when they get to Barron Hill, everyone's left. But it's only because of the Oneida knew a back route down from St. Peter's Church to the Schuylkill. And if you ever choose to drive that route, it's fascinating. The church cemetery was there then. They used the wall to shelter behind, but they would spread, the troops would spread out all across what's now Ridge Avenue and down Barron Hill Road. And that road that goes down to Spring Mill is the exact same trail that existed that the Indians knew about, but no one else did. Well, the British did anyway. And so they escaped. That's a great story. And these are plaques right there. You can see that the Oneida actually stayed behind to create covering fire while the British advanced. When the British got there, they were basically shooting themselves, but they unfortunately took 5 Oneida with them before they did. So, and that cost Barron Hill is now Lafayette Hill. Penal reform. This was the one time that his secretary, August Levasseur, you can read the translation, but translated by Alan Hoffman, who's president of AFL, demonstrably disagreed with his hosts and told him so. He was taken to Walnut Street Prison, where they were experimenting with solitary confinement. And then later, he was later in the same prison, later in 1824, they took him out to the site of Eastern State Penitentiary, which was under construction. It wasn't open until I think 1826 or so. And they told him more about what they were planning. And he said, that's absolutely not appropriate. That is cruel and unusual punishment. And by the way, the reason I can say that is because I've endured that for over a year myself in totally inhumane conditions. It's a little bit more complicated than that because, as you probably know, Eastern State, the folks that conceived of the plans for Eastern State, I think were well-intentioned. In many ways, Eastern State, when they opened, was a model of big improvement on conditions for compared to a lot of prisons at the time. The only downside was everyone was in solitary confinement. But certainly these conditions that he was in Olmütz, Austria, were a lot worse than what people experienced in his state. Nevertheless, that was his position. The engraving on the right actually shows him in prison in Olmütz, joined by his wife and two daughters. When Adrienne was unsuccessful in securing his release, she said, "Well, if I can't release them, then I'm going to join him." And so, talk about devotion, right? It's a beautiful story. And she does. She brings the daughters, and they go there, and they say, "You realize that once you stay, you can't leave." And she said, "Absolutely, I'm staying with my husband." Absolutely unheard of in that period. That would never, never been documented. Anyone would have had that kind of devotion at the time. Okay, so as we've heard, 1824, President Monroe and Congress decide to invite Lafayette back. And we know the Beatles, when they arrived in 1964, arrived to rapturous reception. It was the biggest thing. People said it never really happened. It was kind of a revolution in music. Well, let's look at the stats. And if you see there, you can see that out of a city that at the time had just about 123,000 people, over 65% of them came out to see Lafayette. I mean, just an extraordinary thing. And it's a comparison that, maybe gives us a sense of just what kind of impact. This is day one of his tour, right? And so the reason they expanded was because once people realized he was in the country, everybody that wasn't on the tour yet wanted to be. So instead of leaving at the end of 1824, he wintered in what is now Washington, D.C. area, Northern Virginia, so forth. And then when the weather improved, went south and did a southern trip. Give you a sense, this is just a clipping from the Saturday Evening Post. And you get a sense that the writer of this piece is a little kind of tired about the Lafayette thing. Everything is Lafayette. We can't go anywhere without with saying Lafayette coat, Lafayette blankets, bread, butter, beef, vegetables. Everything becomes Lafayette, and even the women now give Lafayette kisses. What's not to like? So I guess that's the origin of the French kiss. I never really thought about it. It's Lafayette. Maybe we should do that with the Bicentennial celebration. That's the thought. So here we go, 24 states, 13 months, 6,000 miles, as I said. And those are just, you can see, actually trace the route he took. I think you can see with the white dots. Starting in New York, he actually went up to New England first, came back to New York, went a little bit back to New York State, and then started a journey south, which took him down to Philadelphia, where it is said he received the most rapturous reception, as he certainly should. But the cities started to try and outdo each other. So once Philadelphia heard what New York did, they wanted to do something even bigger and better. And then he went on down and then ended up, as I said, in every state that existed at the time. During that time in D.C., he became the first person to address joint session of Congress, the first foreigner ever to do that. And if you've ever been to the House of Representatives, there are two enormous paintings either side of the speaker's rostrum. George Washington is on one side, and Lafayette is on the other. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. And when he came to Philadelphia, they decided they were going to erect 12 arches around the city that he would travel under, and the biggest and the best would be right outside Independence Hall. 6,000 militiamen escorted him from Frankfurt, Arsenal on September the 28th. And it took, I think, 5 hours to get down from Frankfurt. That was outside the city then, of course. And the Committee of Arrangements had set up a rather tortuous route through the city, as it then was, in order for him to see all the various neighborhoods. And that's where the arches were put up. And then he arrives at Independence Hall. Much to the chagrin of the Navy Yard, which at that time was not where it is now, but it was where Washington Avenue, dead ends, opposite Gloria Day. they were very upset about it. So they arranged for him to come down 2 or 3 days later, and he spent all morning down at the so the barouche, the open carriage, and 6 white posters escorted him in there, and he was received by the mayor. And I will tell you that it may be a little grandiose, but we are hoping to replicate at least part of that as part of our celebration. Because we haven't elected a mayor yet. We will be doing that. We really rather hope that once she hears about Lafayette's legacy, that she might, I'm assuming. But anyway, it's a reasonable assumption, I think, that whoever it is, let's say that, will agree that it's something worth celebrating. This is the arch itself, and just extraordinary. Some members of the committee really want to recreate this. I really don't think Independence Hall is going to go for it. But we may come up with some sort of creative version of that. But the 2 statues, the 2 big statues right on the top, I think that's Justice and Wisdom, still exist. They're actually, we're trying to find out who owns them because they've been moved around. They used to be at Papa, then they went to Philadelphia Museum of Art. We think they're still owned by Philadelphia Museum of Art, but then they became part of Fairmont Conservancy, and so it's gotten complicated. But until recently, they were still exhibited at Papa in the main. Another thing that Lafayette's arrival did was he created the souvenir industry. People put Lafayette's image on everything you can think of. This is just a few examples: gloves, scarves, ribbons, and this wonderful vest here, which you can see the inset is an enlargement. And it said that Lafayette had to sit across the table from someone wearing this vest all night long, looking at images of himself. So even for someone who had a touch of vanity, that was probably more than he could reasonably bear. But he did it anyway because he wouldn't have complained, since that wasn't his nature. He goes back to France, and he lives until September the 9th, 1835. He dies of pneumonia after a series of colds. Still in the fighting for liberty and justice and so on. He's buried next to his wife, as I said, 76 years old, in Sauk from Bunker Hill. When he dies, France and America go crazy. It's America. France is a little bit more nuanced, as they are about Lafayette. They don't have quite the same memory of him. He did different things in France and was less successful, obviously. But just to give you a sense, this is actually Lafayette arriving in heaven, saying hello to George Washington and his friends, and this is him shaking Washington's hand in heaven. This is the kind of way he was eulogized. When he died, Andrew Jackson ordered the same military honors as he did for Washington, as had done for Washington. Officers wore black crepe armbands, and flags were put at half-mast for 6 months. Every army and naval station fired 24-gun salutes at dawn and throughout the day, and Congress wore mourning dress for 30 days. And John Quincy Adams, who was a lifelong friend of Lafayette, and actually accompanied him for 5 of the 8 days here in 1824, he gave a 3-hour eulogy of 25,000 words, which you can still read. And it's actually quite interesting. It gives an interesting synopsis. Not much of a synopsis, at 25,000 words, but a really interesting outline of life. And then there was an explosion of naming of streets, buildings, roads, canals, everything you can think of. And we had them. We don't have any streets in the city. There's a Lafayette street I found in East Falls.
Right, Conshohocken.
Well, Conshohocken has one, right? That's Lafayette Street, which runs down to exactly where the ford was. So that was Matthew's Ford that he crossed over. Now, a bridge, obviously, but that's exactly the point where he would have crossed over to get away from the British. But we had, and maybe you can throw some light on this. On the left, we had a hotel Lafayette in the city. I came across the Brent, but I don't know anything else other than that.
Don't we have it, Chestnut, or what is that? Yep, the Lafayette building.
So that would be the one on the right,
Right.
which is now
Hotel Monaco.
Hotel Monaco, right opposite the Independence Hall. Yeah, and it had Lafayette Ballroom, and it had a painting of Lafayette in the ballroom. So they'll hoping to maybe to tie that facility in at some point. And then some of us know that we wouldn't have Independence Hall without Lafayette, right? Because it was he that suggested. And this the National Park Service noticed that this is in the pavement and the sidewalk directly in front of Independence Hall. It has a series of dates, and this date says 1824. Lafayette's visit inspired first use of term Hall of Independence to describe State House Assembly. So plenty of ways of bringing people in to a conversation about Lafayette. I mean, that's another great one. We have a Historical Society of Pennsylvania because of Lafayette. And they are about to celebrate their 200th anniversary. And their book, we haven't seen it, but you've seen the book? And does it not reference Lafayette in the opening pages? Yeah. So, again, what Lafayette, even before he got here in 1824, the notion that there was something to be celebrated and recognized about what had happened was starting to emerge. Because up until that point, I mean, the building was falling down, right? And so they said, Lafayette's coming, we've got to do something with this building. This is an embarrassment. So people started to take more pride in some of these historic buildings. And then, of course, when he was here and subsequently, that really took off. And so things like HSP was founded and plenty of other institutions. How about even, this is a trivia quiz. Oh, excuse me, not this one. Oh, let's do this one. So here we are. Now we're back at the Masonic Temple, right? And what is happening here?
That's the thing from the wife of the Marquis de Lafayette.
Wonderful. Yeah. And so
I couldn't hear it.
that is Adrienne. So Adrienne Lafayette, Lafayette's wife, according to tradition, sewed the Masonic apron that Washington is showing Ben Franklin. So and that is actually, it relies in the temple, in the exhibition. And credit is given to that very fact. I'm sorry, that's a bit. It was a gift from Brother General Lafayette, and it mentions his lodge, his Paris, that he was. Okay, and I apologize to Masons in the room, but I don't think inducted is the right word. But whatever process of becoming a Mason occurred in Paris before he came to America. It was once thought he became a Mason, but he came to Valley Forge. It's now generally accepted that he was a Mason before that. And then this is another trivia question. Where or what is that? It is it's in Montgomery County.
Lafayette.
It's actually the Grange Estate in Havertown. And it was named by John Ross sometime between 1782 when he bought it and before 1800 when he died. What's interesting though is that, and it's acknowledged that he named it because of Lafayette. If you go to, it's a beautiful property by the way, if you go into the dining room, there's a portrait of Lafayette on the wall and a book about Lagrange, the estate in French on the table in front of it. But nobody appears to know why. And it's interesting because Lafayette had only moved into Lagrange in 1799. So, and John Ross died in 1800. So there wasn't a whole lot of time in there that could have occurred. And even 50 years later, we have this item that appeared in the Doylestown Democrat, March the 20th, 1888, and it's an obituary for a one David Kramer, who just happens to be the great grandfather of a member of our committee who brought this to our attention. And he did all these things. He was a member of the Carpenters Company, and he did all these other things. But the headline, the one thing they say, is that a man who knew Lafayette died. I mean, this is still, again, about public memory. This is the thing they chose to focus on. And then even 80 years later, we have the very first American Air Force called the Lafayette Escadrille, which was formed during the First World War in France with French aircraft, I believe, but American pilots. And they chose to name it for Lafayette. And we see that there's also an arch to the escadrille. We're hoping, I'm not going to give too much away on this because it may not happen, but we're really hoping to engage the modern day Lafayette Escadrille in our celebrations in New York and here. So stay tuned. We do have good connections with the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. There will be events in the White House for sure. And so we think our connections are strong enough that something quite interesting might happen. But certainly when General Pershing entered Paris in 1917, he went straight to Picpus, to where Lafayette was buried, and his general, and it wasn't actually him that said this, one of his generals was designated to go up to the grave, and he said these words, "Lafayette, we are here." It was a very strong sense that we, America, was repaying a debt for what Lafayette and France had done for us. And then, well, what can you say? I mean, even a movie. But apparently it does, I mean, it does engage with the Lafayette Escadrille, and it does set it in the right time period. But if you're going to produce a luxury vehicle 100 years later, why not call it Lafayette? Oh, really? Oh my goodness. Oh gosh, the benefit's coming. Do you have time for a 2-minute movie? Honestly, that's all it'll be.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Let's see if it'll play. If it doesn't play, then we won't do it. It's not going to play?
It's not playing on my end either.
Okay. I can, oh, what's happening? Maybe it's loading. Wow, now I've lost everything on this.
Well, thank you very much.